It is the late autumn of 1943, the quiet heart of rural Wiltshire, England, a place of rolling chalk downs and ancient silent stones. This land had not known invasion for 1,000 years, yet the war was now omnipresent, a dull metallic roar in the distance. Every field was a makeshift training ground, every barn a temporary barracks. The peace of the English countryside was a brittle veneer over the greatest military mobilization the world had ever seen. The air belonged to the roar of American radial engines. They flew from countless airfields, names like Tibenham, Wattisham, Duxford, turning the sleepy East Anglian and Southern skies into a vast industrial highway. The 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, had arrived, not with the fanfare of heroes but with the pragmatic, overwhelming force of American manufacturing. Their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were the spearhead of a grand, terrifying strategy to bomb Nazi Germany into submission from the sky. But the men who flew and fought these behemoths were often just boys from the American Midwest, farm boys and city kids barely out of high school. They were strangers in a strange land, finding awkward common ground with the stoic, reserved British locals. This uneasy alliance was the stage for an unimaginable brutality. Our story centers on the small, isolated farm of Thomas and Elizabeth Sterling, nestled deep in the Wiltshire countryside, adjacent to what the Americans called a dispersal field, a satellite landing strip used by P-47 Thunderbolt fighter escorts. Their son, 10-year-old Alistair Sterling, watched the American pilots with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. For him, the planes were not instruments of death, but magnificent silver beasts, the promise of deliverance. In the German High Command, the slow grinding build-up of the American forces was met with a dangerous cocktail of contempt and fear. We saw the first of the Thunderbolts, a former Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, would later recall. They were so large, so heavy, like flying bathtubs. We laughed. Our Messerschmitt 109s, they were sleek, fast, designed for the fight. The Americans? They had the numbers, yes, but not the spirit, not the pure engineering prowess. This was the core historical irony, the initial German dismissal of American technology and logistics. On the 22nd of October 1943, a German reconnaissance Dornier Do 217, attempting to photograph the vast American air infrastructure, was caught by a flight of P-47s. Crippled and burning, the German crew bailed out over the Wiltshire Downs. 3 parachutes descended, and 3 men, hardened by the Eastern Front, landed within sight of the Sterling farm. Thomas Sterling, a man whose life revolved around the soil and the rhythm of the seasons, saw the soldiers and, with a fatalistic sense of duty, went out to meet them, intending to escort them to the local home guard. What happened next was not an act of war, but an act of brutal, petty tyranny. The Germans, desperate and cornered, and perhaps seeking to assert dominance over a land they could not conquer, demanded shelter. When Thomas refused, protecting his wife and son, the German soldiers reacted with swift, sickening violence. The boy, Alistair, watched from the window of the scullery, his father beaten viciously, methodically, in the cold, wet mud of his own yard. The beating was a message, a declaration that even here in the heart of England, the shadow of the Reich could reach out and inflict pain. This was not the polite war of captured officers. This was the ugly, grinding savagery of men who had seen too much. The act lasted less than 5 minutes. The Germans took what little food they could carry and vanished into the fog. Thomas Sterling was left broken, both physically and spiritually, but the true wound was the psychological scar left on his son. The beating of his father in front of him did not break Alistair. It forged him into something hard and driven. The local British authorities, stretched thin by the demands of a global war, recorded the incident. An attack on a civilian by prisoners was a crime, but in the chaos of 1943, it was a tragedy that would likely be buried in bureaucracy. But Alistair Sterling did not forget. He knew where the 3 soldiers had gone, into the dense network of hedgerows and copses leading toward the main railway line, and he knew something the British authorities did not. He knew the path. He knew the land. The American airmen, grounded for the evening, heard a knock on the door of the operations hut. Standing there, small and drenched, was a boy with an old map drawn on the back of a ration card. His eyes, however, held the cold, steady purpose of a man. The beating of a British farmer by 3 German escapees was a terrible local incident, but the response it was about to provoke would be a profound logistical and military reckoning. It was the moment a boy's grief intersected with the overwhelming power of the American war machine. This documentary is the story of that intersection. It is the narrative of how a single brutal act of cruelty was met not by local justice, but by the focused industrial might of 300 American soldiers, led by a single-minded boy who had nothing left to lose. What the 3 German airmen didn't know as they vanished into the mist was that they had not escaped at all. They had merely drawn a colossal shadow of retribution directly upon themselves. If the stories of the ordinary people caught in the machinery of history move you, and you want to ensure these voices are never forgotten, consider subscribing. Hit that button and join us as we uncover more of the untold legends of the Second World War. The map Alistair presented to the Americans was not a military chart. It was a testament to a lifetime spent roaming the Wiltshire countryside. It showed forgotten cattle trails, collapsed stone walls, and the precise seasonal density of every small copse of trees. This wasn't merely local knowledge, it was an intimate, visceral understanding of the land itself. The recipient of this grim offering was Captain Jack Deuce Donovan, a P-47 pilot grounded by poor weather and nursing a deep-seated contempt for Nazi cruelty. Donovan was a pragmatic, hard-edged Texan, used to the cold geometry of high-altitude combat. The boy's story hit him with a civilian reality the war had previously insulated him from. His own father had been a rancher. The assault on Thomas Sterling was an assault on a principle. Donovan immediately understood the boy's intent. Alistair was offering a precision strike on 3 individual targets. The German escapees, meanwhile, were operating on a simple, outdated strategic model. Their objective was the Bristol Channel port, or, more realistically, a German-speaking network that could lead them to occupied France. They moved under the cover of the ancient English darkness, relying on the common knowledge that the Allied forces were too concerned with grand campaigns to waste resources on 3 enemy stragglers. They assumed we were amateurs, a former US Army engineer, Sergeant Frank Rinaldi, would observe. They thought we were still fighting the gentleman's war. They had no concept of the sheer overkill that the American system was capable of mobilizing, even for something small. The tactical reality was this. The P-47 Thunderbolt base, RAF Chilbolton, a fictionalized proxy for a real southeast England field, was not just a fighter station. It was adjacent to the command hub for the US 9th Air Force Service Command and a major training staging area for the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who were preparing for the invasion of the continent. The base housed not just the 200 or so pilots and maintenance crew, but a security detail, military police, and an entire detached infantry company dedicated to perimeter defense and local security, a force numbering close to 300 men. Captain Donovan didn't ask for a squadron of fighters. He went straight to the ground force commander, Major Robert Vance, a man deeply involved in the logistics of the upcoming D-Day invasion. Donovan argued that the capture of the German airmen was not about revenge, but about operational security. Letting hardened frontline airmen wander the English countryside, observing training and troop movements, was a catastrophic security failure in the making. Major Vance, a man who saw the war in terms of efficiency and overwhelming force, listened to the tactical argument, but the human element, the beating of the farmer, was the fuel. It was a perfect storm of motivation, the need for security, the visceral reaction to German brutality, and the logistical opportunity. Vance approved a full-scale, localized manhunt, reclassifying the escaped airmen as a critical security threat. The deployment wasn't 30 men. It was the entire detached infantry company, close to 300 trained, heavily armed American soldiers, many of them airborne veterans, all itching for real action after weeks of monotonous training exercises. The boy, Alistair, became the expedition's pathfinder. He was given a simple job: draw the route of the German retreat. His descriptions were meticulous. They went through the ditch by the broken culvert because the hedgerow there is too thick to jump. This was the intelligence that no aerial photo or signal intercept could provide. The scale of the response was disproportionate, almost absurd. A 3-man German escape party being hunted by 300 American paratroopers and infantry, guided by a 10-year-old boy. It was a practical demonstration of American logistics. If a task was critical, they would throw an overwhelming, industrial amount of force at it until the problem was obliterated. The German assumption of a slow bureaucratic response was shattered by the American ethos of aggressive, immediate mobilization. The hunt was scheduled to begin at first light. The quiet of the Wiltshire night, however, was about to be broken by the grinding gears of American half-tracks and the soft, syncopated march of a 300-man infantry company deploying for a localized personal war. The 3 German airmen, asleep in a shallow ditch miles away, had no idea that they had just initiated the largest manhunt the British countryside had seen since the Civil War. Their casual act of cruelty was about to trigger an avalanche of American retribution. The deployment began with the brutal efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Before dawn, the 300 American soldiers, split into small, coordinated teams, were in position. The company was organized into 3 primary prongs, 2 wide flanking movements, and a central hammer led by Major Vance himself. Alistair was placed under the direct protection of a 4-man military police squad. He wore his own clothes, a small dark shadow amidst the olive drab of the massive American force, but his knowledge was the only compass they needed. He was silent, focused, a living piece of reconnaissance. The 3 German airmen, the non-commissioned officer Heinz and the 2 younger gunners, Dieter and Oskar, were ill-equipped for a prolonged escape in enemy territory. They had little food, no maps beyond a rough compass bearing, and only their standard-issue sidearms and trench knives. The initial strategy, Major Vance later noted in his field report, was simple containment and exhaustion. We had the numbers. We knew they were heading southeast towards Salisbury. We closed the box quickly and let the terrain do the work for us. The Americans employed sophisticated, though rudimentary, tactical coordination for the time. Field radios, still a novelty for localized infantry use, allowed Vance to maintain constant contact, coordinating the movement of 3 independent companies. Their sheer density on the ground meant that no matter which hedgerow the Germans chose, they would eventually run into an American patrol. For the Germans, the initial relief of escape quickly turned into a creeping psychological terror. Heinz, the ranking NCO, expected the low-level, dispersed patrols of the local Home Guard. What they encountered was an unnerving silence, followed by the unmistakable signs of a professional large-scale encirclement. We heard the trucks first, Dieter later recounted during his interrogation, not the small, quick noises of the British jeeps, the deep, heavy sound of American heavy transport, and then the voices. Not English. It was that hard, loud American English everywhere. It was like the whole landscape was talking, but only in whispers. The tension was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Americans didn't rush. They let the escapees exhaust themselves, allowing the psychological weight of their own brutality to settle. They knew the Germans were hiding in the dense thickets near the River Test. The Americans simply closed the circle. The boy Alistair proved his worth multiple times. He identified a location where the Germans had paused, noting the precise type of mud on the boots of one of the soldiers who had beaten his father. He was led to an abandoned shepherd's hut, used for overnight shelter. A single distinct heel mark in the dry dust outside led the Americans to a false wall. Inside, they found a half-eaten K-ration, left behind by one of the pilots during a previous training exercise, and the discarded flight insignia of one of the German gunners. This simple discarded item confirmed the specific identity of the airmen. The manhunt, which had begun as an immediate security action, was becoming an official military operation with a known enemy profile. As the day wore on, the hunters began to use the tools of the modern infantryman. Patrolling squads used whistles to create a grid search, effectively flushing small sections of the thicket. The sound of the American metal and boots became constant, inescapable. It was no longer a chase. It was a slow, deliberate compression. By late afternoon, the 3 Germans were trapped in a small marshy copse, exhausted, soaked and freezing. Heinz knew the situation was hopeless. They had no food, no water, and the enemy was everywhere. But they were still soldiers. The American Major Vance, observing through binoculars from a ridge, saw the 3 dark shapes huddled together. He was not interested in a firefight that would risk his men in a minor engagement. He wanted a clean capture. He deployed 2 half-tracks, rolling them slowly, deliberately into the open field adjacent to the copse. The final standoff was less a battle and more a surrender negotiation orchestrated through sheer, overwhelming display of force. The sight of two M3 half-tracks, their 50 caliber machine guns mounted and leveled, aimed at a patch of mud not 50 yards wide, was enough. For the Germans, it was the crushing reality of American industrial capacity brought to bear on three individuals. Heinz walked out first, hands raised, soaked, and defeated. Dieter and Oskar followed. They were immediately surrounded by dozens of American infantrymen, their rifles held steady, their faces grim. The German officer, expecting a brutal or perhaps even dismissive capture, was stunned by the sight of the organized, overwhelming force. But the most profound moment of the capture belonged to Alistair. He had been kept deliberately out of the immediate line of fire. When the Germans were secured, bound, and marched out, they passed within feet of the boy. Alistair said nothing. He simply stood there, watching the defeated men, his face an unnerving mask of cold satisfaction. The three airmen saw him, the small silent observer, and in that moment they understood. Their brutal casual act had not been ignored. It had summoned an army. The reckoning was swift, final, and precise. The war was vast, but for three German airmen on the 23rd of October 1943, their world was reduced to the cold, hard, uncompromising reality of 300 American soldiers in the English mud. The capture itself was a testament to the logistical superiority of the American war effort, a microcosm of the war to come. But the technical precision of the pursuit provided a valuable, if unintended, training exercise for the Americans. Major Vance immediately recognized the quality of the intelligence provided by Alistair. This was not a primitive hunt. It was a high-speed, localized application of combined arms doctrine using infantry, MPs, and light armor, the half-tracks, to secure an objective. Let's look closer at the tools involved. The American infantry was primarily equipped with the M1 Garand rifle, an 8-round semi-automatic weapon that gave the American foot soldier an immediate, sustained advantage over the German Mauser K98 bolt action. The psychological impact of the Garand's distinct ping, the sound of the empty clip ejecting, was a well-known signal of superior firepower. The Garand, said Pilot Tommy Bama Jones of the infantry company, meant we were always shooting while they were cycling the bolt. In the woods, that difference, 8 rounds in 3 seconds versus 1, it's not just an advantage, it's a guarantee. The half-tracks, the M3 personnel carriers, were not tanks, but armored transports. Their primary weapon, the M2 50 caliber heavy machine gun, was the ultimate tool of suppression. Firing armor-piercing and tracer rounds at a rate of 450 to 550 rounds per minute, the M2 was overkill for 3 men in a thicket, but that was the point. The sheer, terrifying capability of the weapon dictated the surrender. From the German perspective, the technical gap was immense. The Dornier crew had been flying a capable, but aging medium bomber, a compromise of a design fast enough for reconnaissance, but outmatched by the dedicated American fighters. Their only defense was the rear-mounted machine guns, easily shredded by the 650 caliber guns mounted on the P-47 Thunderbolt, each firing over 750 rounds per minute. The irony of their capture lay in the very tools they were using for escape. They had only their knowledge and outdated maps. The Americans had SCR-300 walkie-talkies, early field radios that allowed Vance to coordinate 300 men over 5 square miles in real time. This communications superiority meant the Germans were not fighting men. They were fighting a coordinated, networked military organism that could adapt and respond instantly. The subsequent interrogation of Heinz, Dieter, and Oskar yielded a wealth of low-level, high-value intelligence. The Dornier crew had recently been briefed on the vulnerabilities of the P-47 Thunderbolt's oil cooling system and the optimal approach vector for attacking a B-17 formation at high altitude above 25,000 feet. While minor in the grand strategic sense, this precise technical detail was immediately relayed to Captain Donovan's fighter group. They told us exactly what they thought our planes couldn't do, Donovan explained. They detailed the sweet spot on the B-17 wing for a cannon shot. We didn't just file that away. We immediately reinforced those specific stress points during the next maintenance cycle. Their own casual intel was used to harden the very targets they were sent to destroy. Furthermore, the scale of the American response, the 300 men, was in itself a psychological tool. The interrogation reports noted the Germans' astonishment at the sheer waste of manpower on 3 men. They could not comprehend an economy that could afford such localized overkill. This was the true engine of war, the industrial scale that meant a handful of men meant nothing compared to the necessary display of overwhelming force. The German High Command was always focused on attrition, a direct contest of skill and firepower. They fundamentally failed to understand the power of mass industrial production and logistical flooding. The capture of the 3 airmen, initially about personal vengeance, became a cold, hard lesson in this American reality. They didn't just fight, they overwhelmed. The 3 prisoners were processed quickly and sent to a permanent POW camp in Scotland. They had vanished from the battlefront, replaced by thousands more like them, but their brief passage through Wiltshire had left an indelible mark, a British boy with a score settled, and 300 American soldiers who had just conducted a perfect, albeit bizarre, high-intensity training exercise that proved the true power of their equipment and coordination. Their technology had not only secured the objectives, it had provided a glimpse into the industrial might that would inevitably crush the Reich. Alistair Sterling's role was technically over, but his personal transformation was just beginning. The 10-year-old farm boy, who had once viewed the war as an exciting rumble of distant aircraft, now understood its chilling, precise mechanics. He had not only pointed the way to the Germans, he had, in a sense, commanded a company of American soldiers. Major Vance and Captain Donovan, both seasoned officers, recognized that Alistair was more than just a grieving child. He was a valuable intelligence asset and, more importantly, a moral touchstone. The story of the farmer's beating and the subsequent overwhelming retaliation spread like wildfire through the base. It solidified the American resolve. This was not just a war of ideologies, but a defense of basic human dignity. Alistair was given unofficial access to the airbase, a place most locals viewed with a mixture of suspicion and awe. The pilots, many of them young and far from their own families, found a quiet kinship with the boy. They gave him old flight scarves, showed him the inner workings of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine of the P-47, and allowed him to watch the ground crews at work. This access led to a crucial, unscripted moment of strategic exchange. Alistair, having walked the downed German airman's path, had a unique perspective on the landscape of the air war. "I remember he asked me why we always flew in the same direction," Captain Donovan recounted. "He said, 'They know where you are coming from. The smoke from your engines always points that way.'" Donovan initially dismissed the comment. Standard operational procedure for the 8th Air Force dictated rigid inbound and outbound routes to and from the continent to ensure proper escort rendezvous and minimize friendly fire risks. But Alistair's observation was based on ground truth. The Germans were using the American predictability, not just for interception, but for setting up flak traps, dense concentrations of anti-aircraft artillery around known choke points. A few days after the German airmen's capture, a massive bombing raid over Frankfurt proved the boys' chillingly simple point. B-17 losses were higher than predicted. The subsequent photo analysis of the flight path showed a heavily concentrated flak zone on the standard inbound leg over the Belgian coast, a predictable route. Donovan, recalling Alistair's comment about predictability, took a bold, unauthorized step. Before the next major raid, he proposed a radical alteration to his fighter group's escort route, using a non-standard dogleg turn far to the north over the North Sea, before cutting back toward the German industrial target. The risk was great. Straying from the prescribed route meant risking communication breakdown with the bombers and the dreaded possibility of running out of fuel. The mission was a resounding but controversial success. The bombers in Donovan's sector took minimal flak damage. The Luftwaffe fighters, expecting the standard approach, were surprised and engaged out of position. Donovan himself scored 2 confirmed kills against the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The after-action report ignited a brief firestorm within the high brass. Donovan was nearly disciplined for violating mandatory procedures, but the statistical evidence was irrefutable. His sector's success rate was dramatically higher. The boy's simple Earth-based observation, "The enemy knows your patterns," forced a subtle but critical change in tactical doctrine. The American Air Forces began experimenting with more fluid, less predictable ingress and egress routes, a shift that dramatically improved survival rates. Alistair, the boy who called down an army for justice, had now, inadvertently, influenced the strategy of the air war over Europe. He had seen the war from the ground up, a perspective the pilots, always looking down from 25,000 feet, could never truly grasp. His intimate knowledge of the English countryside had transcended the local skirmish and become a small but vital piece of the grand strategic puzzle. He was the link between the immense detached machinery of war and the raw, vulnerable land over which it was fought. As 1944 dawned, the American war machine reached its full, terrifying industrial potential. The mighty 8th was no longer an infant air force, it was a behemoth. The raids intensified, becoming a daily hammer blow against German industry. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane that Captain Donovan flew, evolved from the dismissed flying bathtub into a terror weapon. This evolution mirrored the narrative arc of our story, a thing initially underestimated proving its profound worth. The P-47, with its immense weight, was deemed too slow and unmaneuverable by the sleek German Me-109s. The true genius of the Thunderbolt, however, lay in its brute force and ability to dive. With its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine and a dry weight of nearly 10,000 pounds, the P-47 could accelerate into a nearly vertical dive, reaching speeds of over 550 mph, far exceeding the structural integrity of the German fighters. This meant that if a Thunderbolt was jumped, its pilot could simply drop away, gaining a massive speed advantage, and then use that speed to re-engage on his terms. "The Germans could outturn us," said Captain Donovan, "but they couldn't outrun us on the vertical. That weight, that beautiful heavy frame, was our armor. We didn't dogfight them. We used gravity to turn the P-47 into a guided, high-speed projectile." The true climax of this strategic evolution arrived on March 6, 1944, the first major daylight raid on Berlin. Over 800 heavy bombers were dispatched, protected by nearly 1,000 escort fighters, including Donovan's P-47 group. This was the ultimate demonstration of the American logistical power, a vast, relentless aerial armada sent directly into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe's response was desperate and total. This was to be the big week for the German defense, a final, coordinated effort to inflict such heavy losses that the Americans would halt daylight bombing. The skies over central Germany became a cauldron of violence. Hundreds of German interceptors, Me-109s, FW-190s, and the new deadly Me-410 heavy fighters rose to meet the attack. In the middle of this chaos, Captain Donovan's group encountered a formation of over 50 German fighters. The fighting was furious, a desperate ballet of steel and smoke at 28,000 feet. It was a battle of attrition that the Germans could no longer win. For every American plane lost, the industrial pipeline ensured 5 more were waiting. For every German pilot, the losses were irreversible. It was during this raid that the intelligence provided by the captured airmen, refined by Alistair's insight, bore its final grim fruit. Donovan's flight, using a pre-planned, non-standard withdrawal route, ran into a surprise flanking maneuver by a group of FW-190s. The Germans had been briefed to aim for the Thunderbolt's previously identified weaknesses, but the slight strategic reinforcements added weeks earlier held. The American pilots, forewarned of the tactic, adjusted their defense. Donovan engaged an FW-190 at close range. The German pilot, confident in his aircraft's superior turn rate, attempted to pull a tight loop. Donovan simply dove, a calculated, terrifying plunge that gained him 150 mph on his opponent. He pulled out, climbed steeply, and shot the German out of the sky from below. This was the core irony proved. The German contempt for the heavy American fighter and their reliance on a predictable defense had become their fatal flaw. The P-47, the juggernaut, was simply too robust, too powerful, and now too strategically unpredictable. The raid was costly for the Allies, but catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. They lost over 150 of their best pilots and aircraft, losses they could not replace. This day, March 6th, is now recognized as one of the key turning points in the air war. It signaled the permanent shift of air superiority to the Allies, a necessary precursor for the invasion to come. Captain Jack Donovan, his wings scarred and his fuel tank nearly empty, landed back in Wiltshire that night. The victory was immense, but the exhaustion was total. The war was vast, but every success, every inch of air superiority, could be traced back to a chain of events that began with 3 German soldiers and a brutal act of cruelty in the English mud. The vengeance sparked by a boy had not just been satisfied, it had contributed to a major strategic victory. The war ended 15 months later, a torrent of violence concluding with a silence that seemed profound and unnatural. The great air armada that had filled the skies over Wiltshire vanished as quickly as it had arrived. The American base, once a bustling hub of steel and men, was returned to the land, the runways cracked and slowly reclaimed by grass. The presence of the 300 American soldiers, their thunderous retribution for a single act of violence, became a local legend, an event whispered about in the local pub, too bizarre and too focused to be official history. The 3 German airmen, Heinz, Dieter and Oskar, survived the war as prisoners. Their casual act of brutality was, ironically, the reason for their survival. Safely behind Allied lines, they missed the final brutal meat grinder of the Eastern and Western fronts. They served their time and were repatriated to a broken Germany, men who owed their lives to the very overwhelming force they had mocked. Captain Jack Donovan returned to Texas a decorated ace. He went back to ranching, the thunder of the P-47 eventually replaced by the quiet rhythm of the prairie, but he never forgot the cold purpose in the eyes of the boy who had summoned his entire company. Alistair Sterling, the 10-year-old boy who saw his father beaten, grew up in the shadow of the American war machine. The episode did not turn him bitter, it taught him the power of focused effort and absolute precision. He eventually left the farm, not for military service, but for a career in engineering, the practical, logistical art of making things work with overwhelming efficiency. Decades later, a quiet exchange of letters took place. Alistair, now a man, tracked down a frail Major Vance, seeking to understand the logistics of that night. Vance, in his final correspondence, explained the true cost of their mission. It wasn't about the 3 Germans, Alistair. It was about your father. It was about showing the enemy and showing ourselves that there would be no safe space for cruelty. We brought down 300 men because we could. We did it to prove that every inch of this island and every citizen on it was defended by the full, uncompromising weight of the United States Army. Your quiet field was our training ground, your sorrow was our focus, and your vengeance was our mission statement. This is the true legacy of the reckoning of Wiltshire. It was not a famous battle, but a foundational moment. It demonstrated that the American intervention was not just a matter of distant strategy and ideological warfare, but a visceral, human commitment to overwhelming force in the defense of principle. A brutality that began with the beating of a British farmer ended with the establishment of Allied air supremacy over Europe. The boy asked for justice, and in response he got a lesson in industrial-scale retribution that changed the strategic calculus of the entire war. The quiet fields of Wiltshire now lie empty, but if you listen closely, you can still hear the distant, deep-throated roar of the double Wasp engine, the sound of the thunder Alistair Sterling summoned, and the whisper of the thousands of rounds fired in the name of a debt repaid. The Second World War is a vast landscape of personal stories that shaped global strategy. If this detailed journey into the intersection of personal vengeance and military logistics resonated with you, and you want to continue exploring the hidden narratives of courage, strategy, and technology, please like this video, share it with a fellow history enthusiast, and subscribe to our channel. Your support ensures the untold stories of W.L.F. continue to be told with the accuracy and drama they deserve.